Moderator, my name is Napoleon Cole. I'm with Austin Bitcoin Meetup. I was kind of a late addition, and actually what we have on the Skype, although I'm not sure it's being broadcast, the video, yet, we have Charlie Shrem coming in from New York. And Charlie is picking up audio from my cell phone right now.
Charlie?
Charlie, you want to speak?
Hey guys. Hey guys, can you hear me?
All right, it works. So, we're obviously here to talk about MT Gox, Mount Gox.
Empty Gox.
MT Gox. We only have 20 minutes, so I'm going to just try to go through this panel as fast as I can. I think what we were thinking is maybe we'd start with Andreas, and maybe you give us a little bit of a history of Goxings, and lead us right up to this point so we can pass it on to Ryan. Sound good?
Yeah, sure. So for those of you who are new to this, this was not the first Goxing. By my count, this was the 6th Goxing. And every single one of these Goxings caused a significant drop in price, a significant drop in confidence, and revealed once again the gross incompetence of a single organization headed by someone who, with very little experience in security, and trying to implement a financial stock exchange in PHP caused untold damage to our industry. Keep in mind, this is the same person who also, as a visionary and an entrepreneur, bought an organization that was initially created for Magic the Gathering online exchange, and there is no mountain, right? There's no Mount Gox. There's MT Gox, and it stands for Magic the Gathering Online Exchange. That should have been the first hint. Took that organization and built a PHP backend that couldn't possibly scale. Nothing wrong with PHP. PHP is a great language for building web applications, not a great language for building stock exchanges. Certainly not if you want to build it as a monolithic application stack, which doesn't scale. And we saw this happen several times. So Gox was always running behind the curve. They were always trying to catch up with demand. We had serious latency problems. Back in April of 2013, we had one of the more serious Goxings when the exchange collapsed under the ridiculous load of 7 trades a minute. Ooh. By the way, that was a time when some people went out and did a call to arms and created Buttercoin. I think what was interesting about that was that within 2 weeks of code hacking, I saw the first implementation on Buttercoin, ran it on my laptop, and got 100,000 trades a second out of it. 7 trades a minute on a monolithic PHP MySQL application that took the price from 266 down to 50 because the exchange collapsed and produced an hour of lag. Didn't halt trading. That would be the responsible thing to do. And one thing we do know about Gox is they never did the responsible thing. And that was, I think by my count, that was the 2nd Goxing. Then we saw the 3rd Goxing shortly thereafter, which was blamed on denial of service. Later we found out that while Gox was behind a CloudFront service to protect it against denial of service, their firewall was configured to allow direct access to the system's IP addresses. So you could just attack the server directly instead of going through CloudFront, which is really an amateurish mistake. If you're into security, you don't do that. I mean, that's so basic. So basic was way above the capabilities of this team. And so that was the 3rd Goxing. Then we saw the 4th Goxing with the withdrawal halt on US dollars. And then the 5th Goxing with the withdrawal halt on the Bitcoin bug, transaction malleability. There was a bug that only affected really Gox because everybody else handled it relatively well. And where they didn't, they needed to make a few minor changes, but certainly didn't get robbed because of it. And then finally we came to the 6th and final Goxing, which was when all of the money was gone. Now, I'm sure we're going to hear a lot of conspiracy theories and a lot of discussions about why and how and what. I think incompetence explains a lot. What became evident was that the cold storage wasn't cold. There's a famous IRC conversation where Carpello says, let me connect to the firewall and access the cold storage to transfer. And then he transferred the 424 transaction, which is pretty famous right now. If you can connect to a firewall to access the cold storage, it's not cold. So that wasn't cold storage. So really, Gox is a story of a person who took on a challenge much too big, never asked for help, and always stayed one step behind the curve and just scrambling to catch up. And I think a lot of it's explained by sheer incompetence. The real question we should be asking is, why did we trust an exchange that took money off the blockchain, off the protections of key control by end users, and put them in custodial wallets that were centrally managed by one organization, essentially removing all of the security protections of Bitcoin and adding none of the security protections of a traditional banking system, and ending up somewhere in the middle as a worst of both worlds? That is the story of Gox. And that's a story that can give us some important lessons.
Excellent, thank you. Now, while Gox has filed for bankruptcy, most of what we know comes out of the crisis strategy draft that was leaked by Ryan. Why don't you tell us about who your source is and where did you get it?
Yeah, sure. So it was given to me by, no, I'm just kidding, Satoshi. I wish that I could share Andreas's confidence that this is an isolated incident, but I actually think that this is also a systemic failure. How I came to get the document really started on last Sunday afternoon, when I learned from a source that Second Market was going to be accelerating its announcement of a planned U.S. exchange. And I had known about this for a couple of weeks, but was obviously sitting on the information in confidence. And it happened right around the same time that Mt. Gox deleted its entire Twitter feed. So I immediately started reaching out to some of my connections within the industry to figure out whether these two events were related. And by virtue of that, actually had the document fall into my lap. Later learned that Second Market did absolutely everything professionally correct, which is very encouraging. But the document fell into my lap, and I was able to quickly authenticate it. The person that sent it to me is an industry insider who I trust very much. And I was able to confirm with a source at the Bitcoin Foundation that the numbers were correct. I was able to confirm with a leading industry investor that the numbers were correct and that he was privy to the same details. I was able to confirm that the author of the PDF came from Mandala Consulting, which is a organization that does advisory work for Mt. Gox, and whose executive in Tokyo is actually a high-profile member of the Tokyo Bitcoin community. And then finally, I was able to corroborate this with Charlie Shrem himself, who had a direct line of communication to Mark Karpeles, and in real time over IRC chat was confirming that this document was in fact authentic. So while Mark said that this was, quote, not Gox, he's full of shit because he paid the guys that wrote it. Afterwards, there was a lot of speculation that this leak had blown up deals. I'd also like to say that that's completely false. Mark claimed that they had investors with interest in bailing out Gox. If so, they were corrupt and criminal investors and were not based in the U.S. In fact, investors like Second Market were approached, in fact, but immediately handed over the information to the authorities as a regulated financial exchange. Immediately halted trading of their employees and went into lockdown mode in terms of compliance and doing everything by the book to not continue to defraud investors. And then finally, the joint statement, which came out shortly after I leaked the documents, was in fact already 80 to 90% complete by the time I made the leak. So this was already happening behind the scenes over the course of a 24-hour period leading up to the leak. What bothers me isn't that Gox is grossly negligent and incompetent and is a perpetrator of a massive fraud which is damaging to the industry, but it also has to do with the willful neglect of the Bitcoin Foundation and its leadership. The foundation knew that there were red flags since the U.S. government seizures in mid-2013. They did nothing to promote consumer protections, transparency, or technical safeguards. CoinLab and Mt. Gox had a conflict of interest that stemmed back to early last year, and neither board member, Mark Karpeles, or Peter Vicens decided to step down. There's a troubling amount of overlap between Peter's company, CoinLab, and Bitcoin Foundation employees. And the organization had no safeguards in place to account for this type of egregious conflict of interest that existed for many, many months and may have contributed to the less informed and less connected investors in the industry keeping their money in much longer than they would have otherwise at Mt. Gox. Most troubling is that Peter and John have expressed no interest in resigning their position from the board of directors, despite all of this information that's come to light.
That's not necessarily true, though. Both John and Peter's terms are up within the next 10 months, regardless, and they're currently all the foundation is at a retreat right now, discussing the next steps to make, and probably will be releasing a bunch of statements over the next few days. So I think Peter and John do take some responsibility, even though that I don't think that all of responsibility falls on them. But I do agree that an elected board needs to be on the foundation by this time next year.
One of the close connections to the foundation said that not only does Peter not intend to step down on an accelerated timeline, but he intends to run for re-election. Furthermore, Patrick Merck himself, the general counsel for the foundation, told me that it is within Peter's right to do exactly that.
I think
that's
that
fine.
Peter had already known that his kind of situation is coming down, and behind the scenes for the past few months, the board itself was actually ready to vote Peter out, but they don't like, the idea of voting someone out sets a bad precedent. So giving Peter the opportunity to resign, just like I was given the opportunity to resign after my arrest, I think is a lot better to do. I do think that we'll see a few announcements over the next weeks. And at the end of the day, you can have every source, but I am a source. I'm still a founding member of the foundation, actively involved. I speak to every board member every day.
Yeah, the bylaws, by the way, are available for all to read. You can find out exactly how the foundation works and what the structure is. You can also find out exactly what the rules for election, resignation, and firing of board members is. There are specific clauses that protect the founding members from being fired unless they are involved in criminal activities. So it's actually structured in such a way that it's very difficult to kick out members of the board, or at least founding members of the board. Now, I'm not saying that that's unusual. That's actually very common in professional associations to provide, for the founding members a situation that allows them to not be essentially squeezed out by future generations. But I think it would serve everyone if we all look up the bylaws and understand exactly how this organization works. If you are a member, you have power, and so consider that when you are involved in elections, and please do get involved in elections if you're a member.
Yes, that is true. Every member has a lot of power, and I think that the last election, the voter turnout was terrible. We need every single member to vote on the next election, because your voice is the voice of the foundation.
Charlie,
I think let me just finish, because I was polite and didn't interrupt those rebuttals. But in my eyes, Bitcoin as a community has lost its moral authority and mandate to self-police and self-regulate, which does irreparable harm from a regulatory perspective. And the Bitcoin Foundation, which is the mouthpiece for this industry, was complicit in allowing this to happen. If the leadership does not step down on an accelerated timeline, and if the sponsors of the foundation, which include blue chip names from across the industry, won't insist that their leadership takes accountability, then we have blood on all of our hands. And so I don't think that it's irrational, or it's me being a firebrand in demanding that these two gentlemen do the right thing and step down for the good of the entire industry's image. There's more to the story. I'm going to continue to release it, but I'm also going to cover my ass from a legal perspective. And I promise you that I'm not going to rest until these guys stop fucking up our industry.
So, Charlie, a lot of us heard your kind of live reaction to Ryan's leaked crisis strategy document on the Let's Talk Bitcoin podcast. It was published a couple hours after you had given your reaction. You want to give us an update on that and how what you take out of this collapse and what you've been talking with Mark about, maybe?
Sure. I mean, before this all kind of went down, everyone knew for the past months, if not years, that Mt. Gox was a big problem, and I agree that enough wasn't done to warn people about what was happening, and everyone was in the dark, including myself. In fact, when the document was leaked, I immediately harshly tweeted to Ryan saying, "Prove who you are, prove that this document actually exists," because I didn't believe it actually existed. And I have to commend Ryan. The first thing he did was call me up on my cell phone and said, "Here, this is the document. Help me confirm its authenticity." And I did just that. I sent a message to Mark, and I said, "Mark, obviously you saw this leak. What's the situation?" And he said, "You know, it's pretty much more or less true." And I said, "Mark, you realize that this could be the end of Bitcoin. This could be a striking blow." And he said, "I know." And that was the last thing he's ever said to me. He hasn't been talking to me ever since then. And that night, I kind of got on a Let's Talk Bitcoin podcast with David Perry from Coding in My Sleep and Adam to talk about what had happened. And we were all caught off guard by this. Well, I think we're all still caught off guard by this. We don't know where the money is. A lot of people think that the coin is actually where Deep never hacked, because where is the proof of that? A lot of people are doing... Yeah, definitely. No, 100%. But I think that their assets is could be a lot more. We don't know, but that's the biggest problem. We're trying to develop a transparent payment to prove to the world that a culture of knowledge and needs to be more open and not with a central point of control or failure. And we're failing ourselves by allowing ourselves to have the central point of failure. And I'm getting texts now. "Oh, I heard Bitcoin was bankrupt," and things like that. And that's embarrassing. I'm afraid to go out. Not that I can go out, but I'm afraid. Because it's embarrassing that something that I'm working for and going out there is just completely. And I was really one of those people that got to know Mark on a personal level, working with him closely when maybe 15 people knew about Bitcoin back in 2010, 2011. And no one... And I say this harshly, no one had thought that he was running this Ponzi scheme, because that's essentially what it was. He didn't have enough assets to cover depositor funds, and we, a lot of people met his wife and his child and saw where he lived and saw that he had a regular family and everything, and you would never think, but no one would ever think that Bernie Madoff was doing the same thing. So
well, let's talk about that for a second. I'll hand it off to you. In the case of, Mark seems like you were saying on the podcast and just now, that he's a family man, he's a nice person, and things like this. But the issue of trust in a particular person is problematic. In the case of, for example, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, U.S. Senator, and New Jersey governor, a person who had millions of people invested trust in him, John Corzine, raided customer funds to the tune of $1 billion. And there's really no one person that's going to ever be able to solve those types of problems. Let's talk to Andrew for just a moment. You're an expert in the regulatory area around here. You've actually had business with eGold before. Maybe you can talk about this.
Yeah, well, let me just distinguish eGold from a Ponzi scheme right away and go back to a point that Charlie was just making. I've seen a lot of Ponzi schemes in my time. I do criminal defense work in Miami, and let me. Yeah, all right. We can get into that later. But the point is that with a Ponzi scheme, nobody sets out to operate a Ponzi scheme. That's not really the desire of the fund or whatever else it might be at the onset of the company. Typically, including with Bernie Madoff, something early on in the lifespan of the business, and this might be the case with Gox as well. Something happened. They lost money somewhere along the way. The value of Bitcoin fluctuated too wildly, or went too high or too low at a given point in time. And ultimately what Mark had to start doing was using the money from old customers in order to pay new money. And I think that's probably, or in order to pay to newer customers. And that's probably the reason why we see him going into cold storage in order to replenish hot storage accounts. But
yeah.
I highly doubt that it would have been his intentions at the beginning to operate some sort of a fraudulent scheme like this. I think he probably didn't know exactly what he was doing. He got in way over his head, and the next thing you knew, it was completely out of control. And what we see in all these Ponzi schemes is that at the time that it starts going out of control, we start seeing cover-ups. We start seeing very stupid, desperate management decisions that, in hindsight, were stupid. But at the time that they were made, somebody thought, hey, this is the best I got, I'm going to take it. And when it's being looked at by a jury or by the FBI in an investigation, it's just completely damning. And that's what this document that Ryan has shared with us is. It's nothing short of damning. But as far as I guess moving forward, actually, Charlie, I didn't know if you wanted to jump in there real quick. Was there something that I said you wanted to address?
I was just going to agree with your point and say that, you know, I should have seen the signs myself, honestly. There are so many things that happened that I kind of blamed on other things, you know, just to give you an example.
Keep in mind, anything you say here will be used against you in court.
100%. But there are you know, things like bank delays, right? And a lot of people were saying, well, it's because of the banks, and there are issues that it takes weeks to withdraw dollars. And what people, the idea that was floated around was that Mark was in fact using the dollars that he was getting in order to buy Bitcoins, because he needed to make sure that in order for people to not be worried about using the exchange, that withdrawing Bitcoins still happened instantaneously. And that dollars being withdrawn can be blamed on your bank, on his bank, on compliance, on all these things. But Bitcoin withdrawals can't be blamed on that, because either you have the Bitcoins or you don't have the Bitcoins.
Let me just make one quick point. I don't know how it's going to be received here. You guys might boo me off the dais, but I'm willing to take that risk. It's this kind of case, and this might be feeding off of something that Ryan said earlier, but it's this type of incident that is going to be very empowering, particularly to state regulators down the road. The state regulations of money transmitting businesses are pretty much designed to deal with exactly this type of an incident. The federal government has come out and said that any type of business that's engaged in the transmission or the exchange of Bitcoin is a money transmitter. And I think it's fair to assume that the states are going to follow suit in one way or another with that type of regulation. Now, if I become a state licensed money transmitter, one of the requirements that I have is that I have a bond in place in every state where I'm operating, in every state where I'm licensed. And the value of that bond is going to go anywhere between $100,000 and millions of dollars, depending upon the volume of business that I'm doing. And the purpose of that bond is to make the individual, the users of that money transmitter in the individual states whole in the case where the money transmitter collapses overnight or becomes insolvent overnight, so that I don't have to resort to international bankruptcy proceedings and international forfeitures in order to be made whole. There's a thing that's there that's located within my state, a bond. And when I lose my money today, because I've given it to the money transmitter to send it to Bisabuela in Mexico tomorrow, and the money transmitter collapses tonight, well, tomorrow I can go to the state regulator and say, this company has become insolvent. I need to be made whole, and I want a piece of that bond. And everybody else who's similarly situated as me has that right. And I'm not saying whether this is right or wrong, but I know that the regulators in New York have already come out with a position on this case, on the Gox case, and this is what they're saying. They're saying this is exactly what we're talking about.
Well, we have just a few minutes here left, so we're going to go to Justice, and he's going to talk to us about something that's even better than a regulation. It's self-regulation, and I'll let you go.
Yeah. There's a thread on the Bitcoin Talk forums that's been going on since, I believe, 2011, called List of Major Hacks, Scams, Thefts, and Losses. And it only lists the major ones, and that list is several dozen long. And so those of us who've been in the Bitcoin community for a while have watched after company has stolen or lost, or maybe lost customer funds. And this has been an ongoing topic about how do we stop that. A lot of people have said, well, we just need to educate users not to let third parties hold their Bitcoins for them. And that is a valid solution. Nobody has ever lost funds that they kept in their own wallet under their control because of someone else's mismanagement. Unfortunately, Bitcoin is growing exponentially, and our ability to educate new users is growing linearly. So there's always going to be a new batch of users who don't realize that they're operating in a new paradigm where, you know, if a bank runs off with your money, at least in theory, there's a way to get that back somehow. In Bitcoin, that's not the case. When Bitcoins are gone, they're just gone. It is an irreversible payment method. This is something new, so we have to have new ways of dealing with it. And anybody who's not been in a coma since 2008 knows that regulators can't do that. If the Federal Reserve Bank of New York can default on 50 tons of gold delivery to Germany, then we can't trust regulators to keep our Bitcoin safe. So one of the things that really encouraged me last summer is I discovered there's a project known as Open Transactions, which has been working on a technology that is a lot like the counterpart to Bitcoin's asset ledger. Open Transactions is a cryptographically secure liability accounting system. And its inventor, Chris Odom, had floated a proposal that he calls voting pools. And what voting pools are is a way to merge the cryptographically secure accounting of open transactions with the multi-signature functions of the blockchain. So you create a situation where competing Bitcoin companies such as Bitcoin banks or hosted wallets or exchanges would, instead of holding the customer deposits themselves, they pool them into a multi-signature pot, and then they all issue their customer receipts based on open transactions to make sure that every customer has unimpeachable proof of what the exchange owes them. Each member of the voting pool then has to audit all the other members in real time to make sure that all of the receipts stay clean. Because since they're dealing with a common pool of Bitcoins, they can't let anyone cheat, or the Bitcoins that could be paid out fraudulently are their own. So in the voting pool situation, you have competitors in an industry all with the ability and the requirement to watch each other, and no single company acting alone can either lose or fail to deliver customer deposits on demand. And I really believe this is the future. It's not completely ready to go yet. Chris Odom and Yamamushi are still coding it. He's back there in the back. But they're expecting that it'll be ready maybe in the second or third quarter of this year. And so once this software launches, we'll have the ability for third-party holders of Bitcoins to be incapable of defaulting on their obligations to customers, at least when it comes to Bitcoins, which is where the biggest problem is.
Andreas?
Can I add something?
Yeah.
So this is one of many techniques that we have within Bitcoin. This is programmable money. We can actually implement surety bonds that involve depositing money, just as Andrew discussed, in holding for customers under a multi-sig pool. So separate from the money that the exchange has, we can also do this with pooled insurance funds, similar to FDIC does. FDIC essentially pools insurance fees from banks and uses them to create a fund that can make whole depositors who get defrauded, or if there's a bank run or bank failure. This is very important in fractional reserve banking, and of course in Bitcoin you shouldn't have fractional reserve banking. So we can do that with funds. We can also do it with cryptographic proof of solvency or cryptographic proof of no fractional reserve, where essentially we use a Merkle tree to add up the balances and user IDs of all of the users of an exchange or Bitcoin bank that's using custodial accounts, and then to prove those against the public blockchain. Every user can individually check that they have been included in the Merkle tree, so they know their funds are counted in the sum, and if all of them can check that, and any one of them can blow the whistle if their funds aren't included, you know that the sum represents the sum of all deposits. You can use cryptographic proof to do that. We can do multi-sig transactions not just for escrow, but also for for backup to create reserves. And I think you're going to hear some announcements at this particular conference on that topic. I think we have solutions. I tweeted to Ben Losky recently that he should look into cryptographic proof of solvency and reserves instead of looking at old-style human-driven institutional regulation. And I have a meeting set for next week to have a discussion with Ben Losky about how they can use cryptographic proof of reserve, because we can do better than the institutional regulators. They failed us miserably since 2008. Not only did the bankers steal $1 trillion, none of them went to jail. At least Mark is most likely going to go to jail if he stole this money. We're going to do better in Bitcoin cleaning up our own mess than the banks did. But I would urge all of you, when you hear the call for regulation, don't just talk about self-regulation. Talk about algorithmic regulation. And the regulators like this idea because it makes their job easier. It automates the auditing, it automates the reporting, and gives them certainty about the status of these exchanges. Thank you.
That's a really
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you, and I'm sure there'll be many questions on that. Justice, did you want to follow up?
Yeah. One point that I wanted to add that I don't think has been publicly mentioned is that things that are sufficient in fiat terms are not always sufficient in Bitcoin terms, and especially proof of solvency. The issue that we're going to run into is that Bitcoin is far more profitable to steal than fiat dollars. We've never heard of a case where some gangsters took a Federal Reserve Bank families hostage and said, wire us $1 trillion or else. That doesn't happen because bank wires are slow and reversible. Bitcoin is neither of those two. So we haven't seen organized crime really going after people who hold other people's Bitcoins yet, but that just means we've been lucky. They'll figure it out sooner or later. So I've seen this push for proof of solvency, and while proof of solvency is great, I don't think that goes nearly far enough because we need to take care of the future risks, not just the ones that have popped up.
So that's a perfect example. Very good point. Thank you. Voting pools actually remove control from the custodian, and they can't be blackmailed into giving up their money because even they don't have power over these funds. And, you know, that's one of the founding principles we have at blockchain, which is we can't steal your funds even if we wanted to because we have no control over the keys. Voting pools allows you to do that even with custodial accounts. It's a great point.
I just want to add one more thing to what Justice said. You can add the federal government to the list of the organized crime that you're thinking of when you're talking about a company like Coinbase being held hostage. I've seen it happen before where any type of a company that deals in money, whether it's digital currency or anything else, they have a user agreement. They have rules in place. They have policies in place that they won't disclose customer information to the government and blah, 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 all these great things. And then the government comes in and it becomes a game of uncle. And they put you in a headlock and they say, you're going to give us this information, you're going to give us this money, regardless of what your user agreement says. And if turning that information over or turning that money over is the thing that's separating you from the clink, you're probably going to do it. So I think that just feeds into what you're talking about.
We're all in that government headlock. Yep. Questions? We'll move into the Q&A if we will. Anyone, just if you would come up this way so we can have you on camera and come on up. Or maybe you could queue up over here to the stage left.
Hi, Brian Goss, Rochester, Minnesota. A question for Ryan. Full disclosure, I'm a member of the Bitcoin Foundation and a big supporter. Do you know roughly over what time period the funds from Gox were lost? And if you have any information on that, who knew what when?
Thank you.
No one does. I don't think anyone knows for sure right now. I'm sure that there's a ton of more technically proficient people than myself. I'm not technically proficient at all. I'm a finance guy. But I know that a lot of people are trying to crowdsource that effort, and then forensic accountants will be getting involved, not to mention authorities. So I have no idea. But if you just look at when the funds were initially seized by both the U.S. government with Dwala and then the Wells Fargo accounts and all that, I don't think it's unreasonable to think that these issues were going on at least mid-last year. And, you know, the thing that really blows my mind, like I can understand the Bitcoin losses a little bit, right? I don't understand how this company, which was running a business with revenue streams could lose that much fiat currency over
transaction malleability? Oh, it doesn't apply to dollars, right?
Yeah. So.
I think they were using the dollars to buy bitcoins to cover the withdrawals, but that's just my theory. I don't know if that's true.
I've heard a lot of people saying things like bears make money, bulls make money, and pigs get slaughtered. And as more and more and more people dump into the Bitcoin market, we may want to focus our ability as experts as far as saying audit, audit, audit. If this company is not complying with our level of transparency, don't do business with them. And more or less go on smear campaigns for institutions that do not want transparency. I wanted to maybe get your guys' take on that.
Yeah.
Who's the we that's doing this?
Sorry, I stole your mic.
That's okay.
So, I think this is the thing that, you know. You go first.
I mean, I just want to know who the we is that's doing this.
Computer scientists.
But how? Like, it's great to have an idea in mind.
Andreas did it with Coinbase. I'm sorry. Andreas did it with Coinbase recently.
Right. So just to clarify, I did a one-off spot check, and I think it's a bad idea to start doing, quick audits that are based on one individual and are not thorough. I verified a very narrow scope, which was that Coinbase, at the time that I checked them, had properly operating cold storage that was solvent. And that is a very narrow scope, and I made it very clear within that environment. We do need audits, but audits require weeks of work. They require high costs. They require independent professional auditors. I've run audit teams like that for banks, and it's not something that you do quickly. In this particular case, it was necessary to do it quickly to reassure the markets that we weren't having a systemic problem across all of the exchanges. But we need to go much further than that. And I agree with you. One of the ways we can do that is by having the exchanges create a common risk pool fund, because then the exchanges police each other. Then the banks, the exchanges, the brokerage houses, anybody who has custodial access to funds, they police each other, because if you come in and start messing with that pool, you expose everyone to risk. So either your premiums have to go up if you're not getting audited frequently enough, if your audit levels are not sufficient, if you're not doing the proper best practices, or they kick you out of the pool and refuse to insure you anymore. I think that's a much better solution, because then you have the experts who are the people in the business policing each other. Now, think about it this way: if Coinbase and Bitstamp and BTCE were partly liable for Gox losses, would they have allowed them to continue without audit? If they were in a common risk pool, they wouldn't have. They would have demanded greater transparency, and eventually they would have either kicked Gox out of the pool or forced them to reform.
I think that's a really great point.
Thank you. I would also say that audits can be like week-long labor-intensive processes, or they could be automated. We have some new capabilities that didn't exist before.
Yeah. So just to clarify, there are two parts to the audit. I mean, you can do technical audits, and you can do technological verification of funds and things like that, but you still have to audit the operational process that the team is following to ensure that the security is continuous. This is a maintenance function. Yeah. And that's about operations and best practices, and you can't do that technologically. You have to go in and verify that the people are trained and that they're following the training correctly. And that's something you do. Even in a bank, when you're auditing firewalls and security systems like that, which is a very different technology environment, you still audit the process. You audit for social engineering weaknesses. You audit for physical intrusion weaknesses. You audit their employee background vetting and checking weaknesses. You audit their fiat bank verification. Even if we can prove the Bitcoin side, we need to audit the operational side of fiat, because that does not have cryptographic proof.
So, just
one last final point on that. I think the thing that bothers me is that there were a lot of insiders that knew better, and they pulled their money out. So that left two other buckets of people: either people that were trying to exploit the price differences, which they claimed was arbitrage, but anyone that knows finance knows that there was a risk premium. It wasn't arbitrage. And then the clueless. And I think that's where there was a systemic failure of leadership to demand accountability and some transparency.
Their money out? I know a lot of people that lost millions, hundreds of thousands, including myself, and I have legal fees to pay for.
No, you know, listen, I'm just telling you there were a lot of insiders that did pull their money out, stemming from some of the issues that were dating back as you know, far as last spring. Charlie, you might not be, you know, objective because you trusted Mark, and I feel bad that you lost money. But you know, if I were in your shoes and one of my friends had told me that everything was okay despite all of the other obvious red flags, I probably would have stayed loyal to my friend too.
Yeah, it sucks. Right. Even guys like Roger lost a lot of money, who was very close to Mark.
Yeah, listen, the insider approach is important here. I think you're bringing up an important point. What Second Market did when they found out that Sunday that something was wrong, they told everyone to stop trading. Right? That is a very important and it is the right thing to do. I found out on Monday afternoon that something was going down that was big regarding Gox, and half an hour later I saw Ryan's leak. The first thing I did was contacted every company I involve and advise and told them to put a blanket ban on trading on all of their employees. No one sells, no one buys, no one plays the market. You have information that is just broken public, you do not touch your Bitcoin until this is resolved. That is the first thing you do. I didn't sell anything that day. I knew well before when Ryan's went out, I already had 30 minutes advance notice, or rather I had heard rumors swirling around. I could have panicked and gone and sold all my Bitcoin thinking, you know, perhaps the price is going to dump. But the most important thing was, no, we do not use that information to trade on insider information. That is absolutely unacceptable. That's a professional thing to do. So Second Market did it right.
We have time for one more question, but please make a comment.
A quick point there. Again, you know, with respect to Mt. Gox, there's not that much here that's all that unique outside of it being Bitcoin related. Bernie Madoff had his company banking at J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan caught on to the scam about a year before it collapsed. They pulled most of their money out of the Madoff fund, didn't tell their own account holders who were also with Madoff that they were doing that. After everything was revealed, the J.P. Morgan account holders who were also with Madoff, they sued J.P. Morgan for violating the fiduciary obligation that J.P. Morgan had to them, and they recovered over $2 billion in that lawsuit.
Thank you.
And the J.P. Morgan executives went to jail, right?
No.
The J.P. Morgan executives went to jail?
No. Ryan, we have time.
I just have to comment really quickly on the insider trading thing, because I've been very public about my activity around the leak. I did sell all of my Bitcoins, and it's because otherwise I personally would have been insolvent in the period afterwards. I had no idea how long I would be able to, how long it would be before I could legally trade again and act in good faith. Just to clarify in terms of timing, I drafted the statement regarding the leak, sold my Bitcoins, proofread the draft so that I didn't say anything that would put me at legal liability, and sent it within a 10-minute window. So I've been fully transparent, and I know some people have criticized me for that, but it literally passes the front of the newspaper test because the Wall Street Journal wrote it up.
Thank you, Ryan. Last question.
So what do you guys think about industry initiatives around compliance and auditing, like data? Almost every venture-funded startup in the Bitcoin ecosystem has announced the intention to create a self-regulatory organization that includes quarterly audits by major financial firms, that includes compliance audits, includes security audits, includes business process audits. Do you think that the industry taking this approach is going to help in interactions with regulators? And do you think it's going to help
Start with Andreas.
Secure compliance?
Well, absolutely. In fact, I think the industry needs to act first, and the reason is we actually understand this shit. The regulators don't. They don't understand any of it. They don't understand multisig. They don't understand the blockchain. They don't understand how Bitcoin gets spent. They don't understand escrow. We need to do this because we understand the technology, and we need to help the regulators understand how to regulate lightly and how to regulate in a way that makes sense with this new paradigm and actually encourages even better security with programmable money, rather than hamstringing us with terrible security just because the regulators don't understand the technology.
Thank you. Thank you for your time, panel. Ryan, appreciate all the information. Justice, thank you. We'll break now, and the next session starts in 15 minutes. Both